You ate a real meal. Not a small portion, but a proper lunch. 20 minutes later, you're hungry again. Not because you're bored, not because of nerves, simply hungry again. And this happens every time. You watch a colleague eat a small portion and not think about food until evening. And you don't understand. Why does it work for them but not for you? Today, as a nutritionist, I'll explain exactly what happens with the satiety signal in your body and why it's not about willpower, but about specific physiological mechanisms that can be corrected. Let me start with a description of something familiar, something that usually causes a mixture of irritation and confusion. Breakfast. You ate eggs, bread, coffee. An hour and a half later, you're already a bit hungry. Seems too early. You hold on until lunch. By lunch, you're genuinely hungry. You eat a normal portion. Briefly better, but within 30 minutes, thoughts of food are back. You think, maybe I didn't eat enough? You add something. By dinner, you're hungry again. Or another version, you ate and physically feel that your stomach is full, but there's no feeling of satiety. There's a difference between stomach is stuffed and I'm satisfied. That second one, I'm satisfied, somehow doesn't arrive. And the third version, 20 minutes after eating, you desperately want something sweet. Not because you didn't get enough from the main course, your stomach is full. Your body just demands something more, especially sweet or starchy. This is a particularly characteristic story. What do all three versions have in common? Not the amount of food and not stomach size. The satiety signal, the one that should travel from the intestine, stomach, and fatty tissue to the brain saying, enough, I'm satisfied, no need to think about food. This signal is not working correctly. Either it arrives late, or too weakly, or the brain doesn't hear it well enough. This is physiology, not character, and it's important to establish this at the very start of the conversation. And that's exactly why just eat less in this situation is so difficult. You're literally fighting a biochemical signal that tells your brain you haven't been satisfied. When you understand this mechanism, your relationship with yourself changes. This isn't weakness of will. This is a body with one specific physiological process disrupted, and this process can be corrected. There's one more moment that's important to say aloud. A constant feeling of incomplete satiety, this isn't just discomfort. There's a characteristic detail that many people describe. They eat and then feel fatigue and a light mental fog. Ate normally but feel heavy. This is also a sign of disrupted insulin signaling. Sharp blood sugar spike leads to sharp insulin release, leads to blood sugar drop, leads to postprandial haziness. Stomach full, no energy. And an hour later hungry again, despite having literally just eaten. This state, without correction, leads to chronic overeating, to progressive weight gain, to even greater disruption of hormonal satiety signals. Every extra meal from incomplete satiety is extra insulin spikes that worsen the situation over time. This is a closed loop that can only be broken by working with the mechanism, not by restricting food. Now, the mechanism. I'll explain as a nutritionist, precisely and to the point. Let me start with the basic concept. Satiety is not simply stomach is full. It's a complex hormonal signaling system in which several organs and several hormones participate. When the system works correctly, you eat. In 20 to 30 minutes, you feel satisfaction and stop thinking about food. When something in the system is disrupted, this doesn't happen. First mechanism, leptin resistance. The brain stops hearing the satiety signal. Leptin is the hormone produced by fatty tissue that signals the hypothalamus. Stores are sufficient, no need to eat. With normal leptin sensitivity, the brain receives this signal and reduces appetite. With leptin resistance, which develops with chronic overeating, inflammatory fatty tissue, and high carbohydrate nutrition, the hypothalamus receptors stop responding normally to leptin. Leptin levels may be high, but the brain doesn't hear it. Here's what's important to understand. Leptin resistance is not a permanent and irreversible state. With reduction of fatty tissue inflammation and improvement of insulin sensitivity, leptin sensitivity gradually restores. That's why people who lose weight and reduce inflammation find that satiety arrives earlier and lasts longer. Not because they want to eat less, but because the brain hears the signal again. A paradoxical situation arises. Fatty tissue shouts, "I'm full," and the hypothalamus replies, "No signal, keep eating." That's exactly why people with excess weight often have higher appetite than lean people. Not because they're weaker, but because they have stronger disrupted leptin sensitivity. There's another paradox of leptin resistance. As it progresses, leptin levels in the blood rise. Fatty tissue releases more and more leptin trying to reach the brain, but the brain doesn't respond. A person with obesity often has levels 10 times higher than a lean person, and yet is hungrier. This isn't a paradox, it's the mechanism. Resistance, not deficiency. Second mechanism, insulin resistance and hungry cells with a full stomach. Here's the key mechanism for most people who don't achieve satiety. With insulin resistance, cells respond more poorly to insulin. Glucose from food enters the blood. The hormone is released, knocks on cell doors, they respond poorly. Glucose stays in the blood, but not enough enters the cell. Cells don't get nutrients. They send a signal. We need fuel. The brain interprets this signal as hunger, and quite rightly, because cells are genuinely underfed despite adequate portions. The digestive tract is physically full, but cells throughout the body are hungry. This is exactly what explains the feeling of ate but not satisfied, especially when you're hungry again 20 to 30 minutes later or craving sweets. The craving for sweets after eating is a particularly revealing sign. Cells want fast carbohydrates, something that will immediately raise blood sugar. This isn't a whim and not weakness of character. This is a biochemical request from hungry cells. That's exactly why insulin resistance so often goes hand in hand with cravings for sweets. These aren't two independent phenomena, they're one. Improving insulin signaling reduces both incomplete satiety and cravings for sweets simultaneously. People who start working with insulin sensitivity often notice that both decrease together. Third mechanism, insulin spike and reactive hypoglycemia. When fast carbohydrates are consumed, white bread, rice, sweets, juice, blood sugar rises sharply. The pancreas releases a large amount of insulin, sometimes excessive. Sugar drops quickly, often below the starting level. The brain registers the drop and signals hunger. That's exactly why after a filling lunch with fast carbohydrates an hour and a half to 2 hours later, you're very hungry again. Not because you ate little, but because sugar swings led to glucose falling below normal. And this cycle repeats several times a day with certain eating patterns. There's a practical test. If you ate a normal portion with protein and 2 hours later are hungry again, this is a sign of reactive hypoglycemia. Exactly this pattern best responds to reduction of dietary glycemic load, to protein at the beginning of meals, and to berberine. Fourth mechanism, disruption of GLP-1 secretion. GLP-1, glucagon-like peptide 1, is a hormone produced by intestinal cells after eating. It simultaneously does several important things. Signals the brain about satiety, slows gastric emptying, making you feel full longer, and stimulates insulin secretion. Without adequate GLP-1, the feeling of fullness after eating is weakened or arrives very late. Here's where the gut microbiome comes in. Certain bacteria, primarily those producing short-chain fatty acids, butyrate, propionate, directly stimulate L cells and GLP-1 production. With dysbiosis, a shift in microbiome composition, fewer of these bacteria remain, GLP-1 production falls, and the satiety signal weakens. GLP-1 is the target for modern anti-diabetic and anti-obesity drugs, semaglutide and similar. They mimic its action. But long before the pharmaceutical path, you can try the nutritional path through berberine, which has documented influence on GLP-1 secretion. There's a simple way to understand how well your GLP-1 is working. Assess how long you feel satiated after a meal high in protein and fiber. If even after such a meal you're hungry again an hour and a half later, this speaks to disrupted satiety signaling. Protein and fiber are the most powerful natural GLP-1 stimulators. If they don't provide satiety, the system is responding more weakly than it should. Fifth mechanism, hypothalamus inflammation and neuroinflammation. This is a more complex mechanism, but very important. Chronic systemic inflammation from excessive consumption of processed foods, from fiber deficiency, from chronic stress, can cause inflammation directly in the hypothalamus. This is called hypothalamic neuroinflammation. With neuroinflammation, the sensitivity of hypothalamic neurons to leptin and other satiety hormones is disrupted. Signals arrive, but neurons respond more weakly. This is a closed loop. Inflammation disrupts satiety. Person overeats. Overeating intensifies inflammation. It can be broken from two sides. Reduce inflammation through nutrition and nutrients, and improve insulin signaling through reduced load and berberine. Both directions work toward the same result. That's why anti-inflammatory nutrients, particularly curcumin, can influence satiety through reduction of neuroinflammation. This is a relatively new area of nutritional science, neuronutrition of satiety, and it explains why nutrition affects appetite not only through caloric content, but also through anti-inflammatory mechanisms. Sixth mechanism, AMPK, and why berberine is relevant here. AMPK, adenosine monophosphate kinase, is an enzyme that works as an energy sensor in the cell. When AMPK is activated, the cell switches to efficient fuel utilization mode. Glucose transporters open, insulin signaling improves, cells begin receiving nourishment. Berberine is one of the most studied natural substances activating AMPK. According to data from a number of studies, its influence on this enzyme is comparable to metformin. More than 2,000 clinical studies have been devoted to berberine, unusual for plant nutrients, and speaks to the level of scientific interest in it. When cells receive glucose normally, their biochemical signal "we need fuel" quiets down. The brain stops interpreting this signal as hunger. The feeling of satiety becomes more stable and prolonged. Now about mistakes. The most typical strategies with chronic incomplete satiety. Mistake 1. Eating less through willpower. This is not only useless, but counterproductive with insulin resistance and leptin resistance. You restrict food, cells receive even less glucose. The hunger signal intensifies, you break down. Restricting food without correcting the satiety mechanism works only temporarily and with enormous volitional effort. The strategy must be different. First fix the signal, then appetite will naturally decrease. This is a fundamentally different approach. Most diets are working with the symptom, food restriction. Working with insulin resistance and leptin resistance is working with the cause. That's why people who normalize insulin signaling often notice they don't eat less through willpower. They simply start being satisfied with a normal portion. Appetite decreases on its own, without a struggle. Mistake 2. Eating frequently and little to not reach strong hunger. Frequent meals keep insulin constantly elevated. Insulin blocks fat burning and maintains insulin resistance. The more often you eat, the shorter the pause between meals, the less cells have time to feel a lack of nutrition and increase insulin sensitivity. Paradox. 3 full meals with normal pauses often provide better satiety than 6 small ones. There's a good rule when working with incomplete satiety. At least 3 to 4 hours should pass between meals. That's exactly how long it takes insulin to drop to basal level and cells to again become more sensitive to it. This is called the insulin window, the period when insulin sensitivity is maximal. With constant snacking, this window never occurs. With constant snacking, insulin never falls, and resistance gradually imperceptibly increases. Mistake 3. Drowning incomplete satiety in sweets. Ate, not satisfied, ate something sweet, felt better. Yes, slightly better for 15 minutes. Sugar rose quickly, brain briefly received a glucose signal. Then sugar fell just as quickly, and hunger returned with the same force. Sweets as a response to incomplete satiety is extinguishing fire with gasoline. Each such cycle intensifies insulin resistance and makes the next episode sharper. What to do instead of sweets after eating? A few nuts, a piece of cheese, or a spoonful of peanut butter. Protein and fat without fast carbohydrates. In 10 to 15 minutes, the desire for sweets often passes on its own, and blood sugar doesn't spike. Mistake 4. Eating many fast carbohydrates and little protein. Fast carbohydrates give a quick sugar peak and an equally quick drop, with subsequent hunger. Protein, on the contrary, digests slowly, maintains stable blood sugar, and stimulates satiety signal production, including GLP-1. A diet with adequate protein, 25 to 30 grams at each meal, is one of the most reliable solutions to chronic incomplete satiety. This works through several mechanisms simultaneously. Protein slows carbohydrate absorption, stimulates GLP-1, creates a prolonged thermogenic effect. The body spends more energy digesting protein than fats or carbohydrates. The satiety feeling from protein lasts significantly longer. Mistake 5. Eating quickly, not chewing properly. The satiety signal arrives with a delay, approximately 20 minutes after the start of eating. If you eat a large portion in 10 minutes, the brain hasn't yet received enough. You've physically overeaten, but there's no satiety. Slow, mindful eating, not just nutritionist advice. It's a way to give hormones time to develop before you continue eating. Another practical technique. Put the fork down between bites. This physically slows the eating pace and gives time for satiety hormones to reach the brain. Especially relevant if you're accustomed to eating fast, at your work desk, between tasks, on the go. Exactly this category of people most often overeats without the feeling of overeating. Mistake 6. Not thinking about insulin resistance as a cause. Most people with chronic incomplete satiety have never checked fasting insulin and HOMA-IR index. Yet insulin resistance is one of the most common causes of this problem. It develops long before diabetes and has no pronounced symptoms, except things like, I don't get satisfied, cravings for sweets after eating, gaining weight despite moderate nutrition, nutrition, tired after eating. Simply getting tested, this is the first step to understanding the picture. Now, what actually works with chronic incomplete satiety? First, diagnose the mechanism. Get fasting insulin and HOMA-IR index. This will show whether insulin resistance is present. Look at blood sugar dynamics after eating, ideally a glucose tolerance test or at least measuring blood sugar an hour after eating. Understanding the mechanism determines the strategy and allows choosing the right tool rather than acting randomly. With high HOMA-IR above 2.5, this is already moderate insulin resistance, with a value above 3.5 pronounced. Exactly in these groups, work with nutrition and berberine gives the most noticeable result in improving satiety. Lower values may speak to disrupted GLP-1 or neuroinflammation, another level of problem but also amenable to correction. Second, meal structure. Protein at the beginning of each meal. Start each meal with protein and fiber before carbohydrates. Exactly this order reduces the postprandial glycemic response by 20 to 30% from the same food. Protein stimulates GLP-1 and PYY production, satiety hormones. Fiber slows glucose absorption and supports GLP-1 secreting intestinal L cells. Practically, first meat, fish, egg, cottage cheese, then the side dish. First salad, then the main course. Exactly this order, without changing portions or composition, changes how long you'll be satiated. There's a clinical study showing the same meal with identical products gives 20 to 30% less postprandial insulin spike if you start with protein and vegetables rather than with carbohydrates. Same lunch, different hormonal response. This is the simplest change with immediate and measurable effect on satiety. Third, reduce dietary glycemic load. Replace fast carbohydrates with slow ones. White rice with buckwheat or legumes, white bread with whole grain, juice with whole fruit with fiber. Each such change reduces the insulin spike after eating and makes the next hunger sensation less acute. Fourth, adequate sleep as a nutritional task. With chronic sleep deprivation, less than 7 hours, ghrelin levels, hunger hormone, rise, and leptin, satiety hormone, falls. That's exactly why the day after a bad night you want to eat significantly more and satiety arrives later. Quality sleep, this directly affects appetite hormones. This isn't a soft advice, it's the biochemistry of satiety. There are studies showing, in people who reduce sleep from 8 to 6 hours for just a few days, the daily caloric intake increased by approximately 300 to 400 kilocalories, not from hunger, but precisely from disrupted satiety signals. This is a huge difference that accumulates over weeks and months. Fifth, reduce systemic inflammation. Inflammation is one of the key factors in both leptin resistance and hypothalamic neuroinflammation. Anti-inflammatory nutrition, fatty fish, olive oil, turmeric, leafy greens, berries. Remove or reduce processed foods, trans fats, excess refined sugar. Sixth, berberine with curcumin to correct insulin signaling and inflammation. Berberine activates AMPK and improves insulin signaling. Cells begin receiving glucose normally. Their "we need fuel" signal quiets. The feeling of satiety becomes full. Curcumin reduces hypothalamic neuroinflammation, restores neuron sensitivity to leptin. Together they work on both key mechanisms of incomplete satiety. About the specific product in the next section. Now specifically about Now Foods berberine glucose support. I'll explain, as a nutritionist, why this is relevant for incomplete satiety. Berberine 500 milligrams per soft gel. Main mechanism, AMPK activation. With activated AMPK, cells switch to efficient glucose consumption mode. GLUT4 transporters emerge on the cell surface. Glucose enters inside without additional insulin stimulus. Cells stop starving. Their signal to the brain changes from "give more fuel" to "we've been fed." This explains why some people who start taking berberine notice a reduction in appetite and cravings for sweets within just a few weeks, without changing portions. This isn't placebo. It's restoration of cellular satiety through improvement of insulin signaling. Additionally, berberine influences GLP-1 secretion, the satiety hormone produced in the intestine. According to data from a number of studies, berberine increases GLP-1 production by intestinal L cells. This directly improves post-meal satiety and slows gastric emptying, which itself prolongs the satiation period. Now Foods berberine glucose support 90 soft gels provides berberine HCl in soft gel form for good bioavailability. Clean formula without unnecessary additives. How to take. Typically 500 milligrams with meals 1 to 2 times daily. The effect is cumulative. Most people notice improved satiety within 2 to 4 weeks of regular use. Start with 1 capsule daily to assess tolerance, then increase. Important. Berberine is a potent botanical that can interact interact with certain medications, particularly metformin and blood thinners. Consult a healthcare provider before use if taking any medications. Link to Now Foods berberine glucose support on iHerb. https://www.iherb.com/pr/now-foods-food-support-90-soft gels/88818 in the description of this video. If you ate and are hungry again 20 minutes later, this isn't because you eat a lot or have no self-control, it's because the satiety signaling system isn't working as it should. Cells aren't receiving glucose normally. The brain isn't receiving the enough signal loudly enough. 3 concrete steps. Get fasting insulin and HOMA-IR. This will show if insulin resistance is present. Change the order of eating. Start with protein and fiber. And consider berberine as nutritional support for insulin signaling. Start with one concrete change: the order of eating. This is free, requires no effort, and produces measurable effect from the very first lunch. Then add the rest. Small sequential steps work better than simultaneous radical restructuring of everything. Satiety is not about the amount of food. It's about how well the biochemical conversation between intestine, blood, cells, and brain works. Establishing this conversation, that's the real task. And one last thing. If at the next normal lunch you feel like you want more, instead of eating immediately, wait 20 minutes. That's exactly how long satiety hormones need to fully reach the brain. Often 20 minutes later, it turns out you're already satisfied. The satiety signal simply arrived with a delay.